Hi, I'm Alexis, and this is going to be my top 10 favorite horror books. I am so excited to talk to you guys today about one of my favorite things in the entire world, and that is horror. I read over 200 books last year and 40% of them were horror. I solely watch horror movies. I don't know what it is. I know there are a lot of studies out there about women, and specifically women with anxiety, that just find horror so comforting, and I definitely fall into that category. Horror is my comfort genre. So without further ado, let's get into the list. I did have a really hard time narrowing it down to 10. Initially, my list was of 23 books because they are all my babies and I just love them so much I couldn't choose. But we got the list down to my top 10 favorites and some superlatives because I just couldn't leave them off the list and I need to recommend them to all of the people. So for my first honorable mention, we have, in my opinion, the best horror manga there is, Uzumaki by Junji Ito. And in honor of this, I obviously had to wear my Tomie shirt. If you read horror, you probably know Junji Ito and have probably even read Uzumaki, but I just couldn't leave it off of this honorable mention list. Uzumaki was my first Junji Ito I ever read, and I could not have picked a better manga to get into horror. So Uzumaki is about a small town in Japan that is haunted by not a ghost, not a person, but a shape, the Uzumaki or spiral. You might not think a book about spirals would be scary, but after finishing this, I could not stop seeing them everywhere, and some of the images in this manga are permanently burned into my brain. And this is a chunky boy. I read this in one day. Like, I know it's a manga, they're fast to get through, but like, you could kill somebody with this brick. I can't even describe the things that happen in this manga. Like, you just have to read it. You just have to see it to believe. My next honorable mention is for the best horror anthology, which has to go to Man-Made Monsters by Andrea Rogers. So not only is this book absolutely stunning, I mean, there are pictures. I originally started this on audio, and after the first story, I knew I loved it so much, and B, found out there were pictures, so I immediately bought it. There are pictures that go along with each story, and they are so stunning. Besides the pictures, this anthology is a work of art. Usually with anthologies, they are not my favorite. You always have like a standout story and the rest feel like filler, and by the end of it, you give it like a 3-star because some were great and some were not. This one, solid 5 stars. I don't know if I rated a single story in here lower than 3.5 stars. I read this in early 2023, so I'm trying to remember what my favorite stories were. An Old-Fashioned Girl was so good. It was about vampires. Man-Made Monsters, the title story, was like a Frankenstein-y retelling. And as an added bonus, there is a family tree in the very beginning because each story actually follows a generation in this family, and it was so cool to connect all the dots at the end. Next up, my honorable mention for best historical fantasy horror has to go to Slewfoot by Bram. This is a really beloved book. I know everybody screams about how good it is, so if you haven't read it yet, what are you doing? I am another person telling you, drop everything and read this book. This book takes place in Connecticut, 1666, where our main character, Abatha, is accused of being a witch and enacts her revenge on the townspeople. Not only is this story incredible, you will be screaming in support of Abatha by the end. There are also pictures throughout, and oh my god, book is worth it for the illustrations alone. There is one scene at the end which is some of the most gruesome descriptive body horror I have ever read, and I love it so much. And finally, for honorable mentions, I have to talk about my favorite nonfiction book about horror, which is It Came From the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror, and edited by Joe Valise. First of all, how could you not see this cover in a bookstore and immediately buy it? That was me. I had never even heard about it. My local bookstore posted this cover and I went that day to buy it. Did tab it and highlight so you can see there was a lot of really interesting stuff in here. This is a collection of essays by popular horror authors talking about their favorite horror movies, how they viewed them in a queer lens, and how they shaped them into the person they are today. One of my favorite essays in here is written by horror author Carmen Maria Machado. She talks about Jennifer's body and how it was really like a bi-awakening for a lot of women, myself included. Another essay I really loved was the one on Jaws. I hadn't seen Jaws since I was a little kid and probably didn't even pay attention to it. So reading the essay, Three Men on a Boat, and then going back and watching Jaws through this queer lens was so funny. If you are a fan of horror movies at all, I really recommend you picking this up. And with that, we can move on to my top 10 favorite horror books of all time. In number 10, we have House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. There is just something about vampire books that I have never read one that I didn't like. We can probably blame my Twilight days for this, but vampires are just my favorite creature to ever exist. I love everything having to do with them, and this book was no different. Even though this book is not your traditional vampire, they don't call them vampires in this story, they're vampires. So House of Hunger is this aristocratic house that hires servants like our main character Marion to be blood maids and give their blood to the Countess. Of course, there are tons of queer vibes in here between Marion and the Countess that I loved so much. It is not a love story. I'm very much toxic for liking these two together, but I just really love the Countess's character and fell for her just as hard as Marion. And if you read The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson and didn't love it, I really recommend checking this one out. I also didn't love The Year of the Witching, but I am so glad I gave her a second chance because this has made it onto my top favorite horror books. In the number 9 slot, I had to throw in some killer mermaids. Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant is a sort of horror sci-fi with a little bit of fantasy because we have the mermaids. This is about a ship of researchers that just went missing. There was some video footage recovered, but nobody can really say if it's real or not because there were mermaids in it, and mermaids don't exist, right? So when this book starts out, we are following the sister of one of the crew members who disappeared on the original voyage, and she is getting ready to depart on a second voyage to see what really happened to the first ship. This one had everything you can ask for. It had horror, it had romance, and if you didn't know, Mira Grant is the pen name for Seanan McGuire, so you know the writing was just incredible. Number 8 on my list is a horror book I read way back in January 2022. I think it might have been one of my first horror books ever, and that is The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. This was my first T. Kingfisher book, and I knew from the start she was going to be a new favorite author of mine, and she has not disappointed me since. In my opinion, this is definitely the scariest of her horror books. So in the beginning of this, we are following Kara, who is helping out in her uncle's taxidermy slash oddities shop, and she ends up finding a hole in the wall that leads to a room that should not exist. And her friend venture into the hole and discover a hallway that should not exist, and more rooms, and suddenly a door to another world. And this world, they discover, is one of the creepiest worlds I have ever read about. The creatures and the imagery of this world live rent-free in my head to this day. I really need to reread this soon. I loved it so much. And looking back now, the ending might have been a little bit silly, but at the time, I was on the edge of my seat, like hyperventilating, what's gonna happen? And as soon as I was finished, I ran to my partner and I gave him the whole synopsis of every little thing that happened in this book because I loved it so much. For number 7, we have Chlorine by Jade Song. Another mermaid horror book. Are we onto something? Is that my new favorite fictional creature? This book follows high school student Ren Yu, who is on a competitive swim team and might be turning into a mermaid. Not like mermaid in the metaphorical sense, like physically she is turning into a mermaid. This book is another great one that shows the real life struggles of being a teenager, being a girl, pressures of high school and swimming competitively, with the mixed in horror of literally turning into a mermaid. The body horror in this book was so visceral, and maybe this was my fault because I read it while getting my forearm tattooed, and that is not a fun spot. I had to put the book down because I was going to pass out from the physical pain or reading about the pain that was happening to the main character. I can't even tell you. Just know that this one is going to make you sick. But like, in the best way possible and exactly what we want from our horror books. Number 6, we have another beloved one, My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Grady Hendrix is one of my favorite authors ever. I actually saw him speak this November, and he is not only hilarious, but maybe one of the sweetest people I have ever met. He stood there and signed everybody's book that wanted it signed, even though we were way past the time. It was so nice and talked to everybody in line. It was really hard to pick my favorite Grady Hendrix, but I think I have to go with this one. I remember starting this audiobook. I think it was probably only my second Grady Hendrix I had ever read. I knew I read Horror Store before this, but I saw this audiobook was available. I remember putting it on in the morning, and before I knew it, it was dark out and I had finished it all in one sitting. Such an incredible ride. Not only does this one give us the perfect 80s horror movie vibes, it's also a really great story about friendship. In this book, we have high school sophomores, Abby and Gretchen. They have been best friends literally forever, and one night they have a sleepover where Gretchen disappears for a few hours, and when she comes back, she's different. And as the days and weeks pass, Gretchen is not getting better, and it becomes very clear that she has been possessed. The lengths that Abby goes through to save her best friend Gretchen, so heartwarming, and that's just something I love about Grady Hendrix books. He never takes his horror too seriously. He's not really trying to scare you. He just wants to have a fun time, and he really did that with this one. Number 5 on my list just got added at the end of 2023, and of course, that is Mayfly by CJ Lead. This book came out of nowhere at the end of 2023, and then suddenly I saw everybody screaming about how great it was, and they were not wrong. Look, we have Grady Hendrix right on the front calling it an apocalyptic Anaheim Psycho. I have also seen this described as American Psycho for the girlies, and it is 100% correct. As somebody who read American Psycho and did not enjoy it, like, I get the message, but in my opinion, the movie was better. The book was just too much. Anyways, like I was saying, the book was just too much to handle. You couldn't look away and escape the horrific things that Patrick Bateman was doing to this woman. You just had to keep reading and experiencing that, and it wasn't a good time. I will say the rat scene in American Psycho, wasn't expecting that to pop up. In Mayfly, we follow our main character, Maeve, who is literally a princess at Disneyland by day and a serial killer at night. Some of the things that she does to people in this book, like, I don't even think I'm allowed to say on the internet that I enjoyed this. This is another one that I just put on the audiobook because it was available, not really knowing what I was getting into besides everybody was raving about this book. And by the end of it, I went out, bought myself a copy, and I still need to reread and annotate this because not only was this horrific, it was also so beautifully written, which I was not expecting. CJ Lead is definitely one of my new favorite authors, and I cannot wait to see what she comes out with next. Of course, it is not a horror recommendation list without a Stephen King book. In my number 4 slot, I have none other than Pet Sematary. I don't read too much Stephen King because there are so many other horror authors out there that, in my opinion, just do it better. But I have to give the man credit. Pet Sematary is one of the best horror books ever written. To this day, I am still chasing my Stephen King dragon to find a horror book that hits me as hard as this one did. I think about this book daily. In this book, of course, we have our main character, Lewis, who moves to a small town in Maine with his family. Behind their property is a pet cemetery where when you bury your pets, they do not stay dead. Part of what I love so much about this one is exactly what Stephen King says in the introduction. All I know is that Pet Sematary is the one I put away in a drawer, thinking I had finally gone too far. Okay, we have made it to my top 3 favorite horror books, and in the 3rd slot, it has to go to Stephen Graham Jones' My Heart is a Chainsaw. If you are anything like me and obsessed with horror movies, specifically slashers, you have to read this book. Jade Daniels is all of us. Completely obsessed with horror to the point where she starts to think a horror movie is happening around her. On the surface, this just looks like another slasher, been there, done that. But diving deeper when you get to the end and realize what actually happened, oh my God, my jaw was on the floor. I just love Jade so much. She is one of my favorite fictional characters to ever exist, and make sure you keep your eye out. There might be a special vlog coming soon where I reread this and the sequel in anticipation for the third book coming out this spring. Number 2 slot has to go to the only book that has ever actually scared me. That is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Now, if you've seen the Netflix show, stop it. Stop everything you're thinking. It is nothing like the show. I love the show, but it needs to exist completely separate from this book. You need to know that all they really took from the show is the name of the characters and the house. Everything else is completely different. So I know a lot of people go into this and they end up being disappointed because they're expecting the action of the show, and it's not. It's a lot slower than that. This is really a character study and just watching these people slowly descend into madness while at this house and the things that Hill House makes them do, and I loved it so much. There is a scene where they are sleeping in the house and there is knocking on the walls and doors. I had to stop reading, turn on all the lights. I literally couldn't sleep that night. I don't know what it is, just something about ghosts freaks me out so bad. You literally cannot tell me that Shirley Jackson didn't know what she was doing when she wrote Theodora and Eleanor like that. They are absolutely lesbians, and I will take no criticism. The ending of this one just really sneaks up on you, and I don't think I have ever read a better ending in a horror book before. I haven't actually told you what this one is about. We follow these group of people who are going to the Hill House to stay there and try and get scientific evidence of ghosts. And obviously things start to go wrong very fast for them. And finally, we have made it to my top favorite horror book and possibly my favorite book of all time, A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. When I was making my channel, I threw around the idea of calling it A Certain Reader, but I wasn't really sure if we would get the reference, but that is how much I love this book. Who knew that a book about a female cannibal could be this beautifully written? This book really took me by surprise when I read it in 2022. It was my favorite book that year, and I have not stopped thinking about it since. And I have never loved a cover as much as I love this cover. I have it always facing out on my shelves, and eventually I'm just gonna have to get a print of this art and hang it on my wall because that is how much I love this woman. So if you have not read this yet, I highly recommend if you can handle it. This book follows Dorothy, who is a food critic slash writer. She is very well known for this, and one day she is hungry for something other than food. So she begins killing and eating the men in her life. This book was so beautifully written. Every single one of these tabs are just gorgeous quotes about what it means to be a woman and love and sex and food, and it is so good. And not only is the description beautiful and you can taste the food that she is describing, not the humans. Chelsea G. Summers writes this as if it is her autobiography and she is telling you the story from jail, as if she is the main character who has done everything described in this book. It was so realistic, I had to keep reminding myself, this is fiction. This is not a real woman who really did these things. I almost want to describe this as a really pretentious artsy horror, which are my favorite type of contemporary books. I just love the dramatic over the tops, and then to weave in this horror element of killing and eating men was everything I could have ever hoped for. So if you have any recommendations of more books like A Certain Hunger, please let me know. I am always looking for new horror recommendations, so please let me know below. And if you have similar taste in books as me, let me know. I am always looking for some horror best friends to talk about books with. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you read a good book today, and I will see you again in the next one. Bye!